A knitting friend just got in touch to discover whether we can do pull-up stitch on modern knitting machines. Here's an example of it. It's very often used and included in the manuals of Brother 8-button machines. My 8-button machine playlist has 28 videos as of now, and I do touch on that. Basically, pull-up stitch includes longish floats that are lifted and then incorporated into the fabrics. The examples that I'm showing you are from this Brother Book 3 of stitch patterns. Here's where they are referenced in the table of contents, and here is what the chart's telling you how to make them look like. Those charts would be a little hard to follow for other Brother machines, but it's not a problem. In this white on white sample, the textural upside down U's started out as floats that were lifted and hung on a needle in rows that came after. The floats were created where the red line is, then lifted and hung where the pointing finger shows. We can do that on other machines too, of course. Today I'm going to demonstrate on a Brother punch card, and it would be just the same on an electronic Brother. The floats would simply be created based on electronic selection rather than punch card, no biggie. Let's start with the most basic method using hand selection. I'm going to bring 7 needles all the way forward on each edge of the work and engage both part buttons. When we knit across, the needles that were brought forward are going to knit, and in between them there will be a longish float. So we'll select the same needles again, and for this easy design, do the same thing 4 rows in a row, which will result in 4 floats. I'm going to knit a couple more plain rows, then lift all 4 floats and hang them on the center needle. And now we need to be back into stockinette settings. One repeat of this particular pull-up stitch has now been made. We can do this at whatever interval we wish to do it up the fabric. I could have immediately started another round of the same thing, or I could have moved it over on the fabric, or I could have done what I did, which is knit a couple of rows, followed by 4 rows of slip, creating floats, and lifted the floats. The same exact pattern gets a little bit more dramatic if we add a color change. Here the multicolored pink yarn was used to create the floats, then 4 rows of solid fuchsia yarn, lift to the center needle, and then change back to the marled yarn. It's pink and blue, actually. I'm not sure that it will show up in the video what the exact colors are. We'll knit 4 more rows, creating long floats in the same manner we have been. Then lift those floats to the center needle. It's important that there be at least 1 stockinette row after hanging the floats. Otherwise, that center needle won't knit off, and we want it to. So we have to change to end settings for the row or 2 after, whether we change colors there or not. I experimented a little with this one, but basically it's 4 rows making floats with the pink and blue marled yarn, 4 rows of the darker fuchsia pink, hang the floats on the centermost needle, 2 more rows of the darker fuchsia pink at stockinette settings, and repeat. And here's the swatch made with that technique. As you notice, the purl side is the right side of this fabric. That's where the decorative effect occurs. Next, I tried a punch card swatch that was a total failure, but not because of the punch card. Don't give up yet. It's the card I used. Set up the machine for Fair Isle with KC on the upper right, the top of the center buttons engaged, and 2 colors threaded. And I randomly hung groups of floats as they appeared. I'm sure you could find a way to make something interesting out of this, but this card has very long floats, somewhat randomly arranged, and the results were not to my taste. Switching to a card with 3 stitch-long floats that would occur over the course of 4 rows produced much superior results. After installing the card into the feeder, I knitted a plain knitting row and then turned it to KC so that I could find out when the first patterning row occurred. I do that because all my cards are mixed up in a drawer, and I don't mind that. I just find the first patterning row this way. Once I locate it, I lock it for one row on that first patterning row, then change to Fair Isle settings and allow the card to advance. Since we're making floats for 4 rows, I knitted 4 rows, then lifted the floats and hung them on the needle that is between the areas where the floats are being made. You do have to make sure that those needles stay in the position that the card has selected, otherwise your pattern will get messed up. Now it'll alternate, and the floats will be made on the alternate groups of needles. And I lifted them and hung on the intervening needle. The only thing I found that I had to be careful of was not to disturb the order of the needles, because it being a brother, they're pre-selected as to who knits and who creates floats next row. Brother had in mind, of course, that we would use the knit side of this fabric and we wouldn't lift floats, and we'd get a Fair Isle pattern that resembled elongated checks. But this is an interesting way to use the card instead. It goes quite a lot faster than hand selecting because I don't have to hand select every row. The card is doing it for me. And you could use quite a number of cards that were intended for Fair Isle to get different effects using the same technique. Here's a swatch with the identical technique, but I've changed yarns from the solid color one to a self-striping yarn. That can be pretty interesting. You can see why logically this fabric is going to have a significantly different gauge than the same yarn knitted in stockinette. So if you decide to use it, definitely check gauge. It occurs to me that the pattern that I've just been using, the one that has 3 stitches across making floats for 4 rows, would make wonderful mock smocking for little girls' dresses. I did find that a larger stitch size than usual for the yarns in use seemed to be optimal, and that you must be very careful to pick up all of the floats you had in mind. It's easy to miss one. Other than that, it's a simple stitch and lots of fun. More videos to come on making pull-up stitch on other kinds of machines, including hobby machines.